Seaweed does not sell like Big Macs. And so there's a reason for that. And part of that is simply cultural. Um, a lot of it is cultural. In fact, I would say most of it is cultural.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Wild Dispatch. I'm Robin and I'm back with more skills and stories from the wild. Now, we've had a huge variety of guests in the past 26 episodes. We've had many fantastic storytellers. We've had folks with incredible knowledge of the wild world around them. But I think I can honestly say that I'm never going to meet a person quite like Larry Knowles. Now, he's also a great storyteller, and he's incredibly knowledgeable about lots of things, really, to be honest, but mostly around the area of coastal ecosystems, through spearfishing, and also the seaweed that he harvests for his company, Rising Tide Sea Vegetables. But on top of that, he's also just a really fascinating guy. He's got a kind of mind-opening perspective of someone who just interacts with nature a little differently than the rest of us. Luckily for me, he lives just around the corner, so I can tap into that big brain of his anytime I like. Well, almost. Larry's probably hearing that and going, well, phone to silent. But it's always fun to do these things in person, so I got to hang out with and chat with him for a few hours at his offices, amongst a bunch of boxes packed full of delicious seaweed-based snacky goods. So if you're wondering, we did get to try some. It was very delicious. We're going to get on with this episode any second now, but first, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you happen to enjoy this podcast, not already yet with my waffling, give it a chance. But if you listen to this episode for a little longer and you're enjoying it, or if you've been enjoying the episodes previously, then please feel free to share it with a friend who you think would enjoy the same kind of subject matters. Right, that's enough waffling. It's time to get on with the episode.
Welcome to the Wild Dispatch!
Hi, Larry.
All right.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Was that a meditative moment there? Before,
Oh, yeah. I'm used to that.
That's good. I love it. I mean, I do exactly the same thing. So it's nice, just a little moment to center yourself before jumping in.
Yeah, for sure.
So thank you again for jumping on the podcast. I'm excited that we managed to make this happen. I have a little thing in my mind about how we first met, or at least you first arrived on my radar. That was quite a while ago, because I have for better or for worse, this local area, which is Mendocino County, up in Fort Bragg area, there is a listserv, an email opportunity for people to connect with one another and make announcements and things. And I think that you first popped up there because a few years ago you were putting out an email asking if there was anyone interested in working for your company.
Oh, harvesting seaweed.
Exactly, harvesting
Got
seaweed.
it.
So I was kind of like, wow, wait, what? Harvesting seaweed? This whole thing suddenly emerged on my radar. And that's actually before I even had the podcast or anything like that. Even it was just a mere twinkle in my eye.
Ah, okay.
At that point. So it was only after a bit of time that thinking about who would be great local guests to talk to that you popped in my mind after thinking about the seaweed, the whole seaweed thing. And I thought, well, you know, harvesting sea vegetables is a whole world that I would love to know more about. So that's why I got in touch with you. And we've since had quite a few chats together, and we've gone off on some adventures as well. We went mussel picking.
Right.
We did a bit of spontaneous bird watching as well. The thing that I would love to do first of all is, I think maybe, Larry, I should first let you speak and maybe give a quick intro as to who you are and what you're all about in a nutshell.
In a nutshell. Okay, let's see. Where do I begin? Well, interestingly, I actually grew up in the desert. And I grew up outside of a small town called Barstow. Actually, I lived on Route 66.
Okay.
And, people say, like, wow, like, people live in Barstow? Really? like, all I remember about Barstow was that it was 115 degrees and my car overheated and it cost me $2,000 just to get my car fixed. And like, you grew up there, really? And so, interestingly, for me, I actually love the desert, and I love this, the I love hot weather, and so here I am living on the Mendocino coast,
Which is quite the opposite.
which is like living on the British Isles, and I have this lizard on a rock body, so I'm always wearing more clothes than everybody, and my wetsuit's always like totally
3 mils
dialed
thicker.
in. Yeah, right. But really. Some of the formative experiences that I remember from growing up in Barstow were that I lived on the Mojave River, and when my parents first bought the property in around 1950, it was a cottonwood riparian corridor, this beautiful riparian corridor, and the Mojave River flowed all year round. Then water projects went in. Up in the mountains, up in the San Bernardino Mountains, and there was diversion that happened of the Mojave River. So, really, what I was experiencing is the phenomenon of that was really immortalized in the book Cadillac Desert, which is basically water politics, and so that really framed my way of thinking about resources and food and ecosystems, and I saw the effects of our overuse of resources like right in my backyard. Like the cottonwood trees literally died in my childhood. So I remember cottonwood trees when I was very young.
Yeah.
And those same cottonwood trees died in the space of about 10 years.
Wow.
So because they're shallow rooted in this water table, we were actually right in the floodplain of the Mojave River. And so really that got me into thinking about resources, and also in Barstow, believe it or not, I got into transcendental meditation when I was like 14. And
Say that again. Sorry, what kind of meditation?
I got into this big movement in the 70s, which was called transcendental meditation.
Okay.
And I also became a vegetarian, and I got into really thinking about whole foods and thinking about food, and so that whole all those experiences really were formative, leading up to my interest in wild food, in eating whole foods, and ultimately I'm now an omnivore. But that whole evolution really was that whole evolution was something that happened that led me to becoming more of a wild foods person, and shepherding rising tide sea vegetables, and developing a lot of our harvest systems, and really wanting to supply people with a good product and do some kind of right livelihood. So, does that answer the question?
It does.
Okay.
It does. I mean, what I was about to jump in to say is that you are, well, actually, Rising Tide Sea Vegetables. Okay, tell me a little bit about that company, what it does, just so that people kind of understand.
Sure. So Rising Tide Sea Vegetables actually started in 1981.
Okay.
And it actually, and there was another business on the Mendocino coast that started in 1980. That's Mendocino Sea Vegetables, and another couple of businesses were spawned after that. But in the late 70s, when the macrobiotic movement was a really important influence among mostly white Americans, where Japanese dietary principles were brought over by a couple of really great Japanese ambassadors, Michio Kushi, Georgia Hara, who started centers for macrobiotic food. And so seaweed became a thing. And so a lot of the back to the landers got into that. So like this on the Mendocino coast, there were some people getting into it. And I'm like my ex-partner, Kate Marienchild, who started Rising Tide in 1980,
Okay.
was into it. And other people on the Mendocino coast. And then also another seaweed industry was started by a guy named Shep Earhart, Maine Coast Sea Vegetables in Maine. And so then they're still really they're the largest wild harvested seaweed company in the country. And so that whole movement really spawned essentially a non-Asian market for seaweed and more of a fairly, like it inspired people to want to eat more superfoods, and seaweed is one of those superfoods. And so that movement is really what kind of spurred a lot of people to get into seaweed, get into, eating local and all of that stuff. And so, that's a lot of my focus too, is I love eating local. Like I'm a free diver and spear fisherman. And that's another way I love to be in the ocean. I love to free dive and spearfish. I suck at pole fishing. I just like I have no idea why. Like I just and I also just like with seaweed harvesting, where I'm in there, I'm seeing these plants that are doing this amazing thing. There's this kind of volition that I'm seeing in these plants where there is just such a motivation to really move through the same cycle that we humans are moving through. I mean, we're like going toward having this full life and reproducing and doing all that stuff. And boy, when I'm out there with seaweed, it's not any different. I mean, the vitality is just kind of like right there, like something's going on in that being, that organism, whatever.
Yeah.
That is really compelling. I mean, like they're into it. And it's the same when I'm free diving. It's really a sobering and humbling and thought. Well, how would I put it? When I'm in the process of free diving and when I'm not just snorkeling, because I also love to snorkel because the ecosystems here, especially the subtidal ecosystems with all the anemones and all the critters, are so amazingly beautiful. I love to just snorkel around here. But when I'm free diving specifically to spearfish, I'm acutely aware of the fact that these fish are really just cruising around doing their life just like me, just like the seaweed, and I am gonna end somebody's incarnation essentially. And I'm really aware of that. I'm really aware of that both in the fact that like when we're trimming seaweed, that we're definitely affecting this organism. I mean, we're generally, all the different species, we're actually trimming it so it's going to continue to grow, but we're definitely affecting it. I mean, we're in there affecting something. And the idea is to harvest in a very regenerative, sustainable way. But that's a separate issue than how I'm affecting that person, like,
yes, absolutely.
Like I could rationalize, I have to kind of rationalize that. Like I have to eat, I have to do this thing. So
it's part of the experience of being
it's part of the
alive.
experience. And so doing either seaweed or taking fish, it's really part of that whole ethic of understanding that I'm having a direct impact on somebody.
Yes.
And that's real, and that there's no denying that. And to me, I find that really humbling and compelling.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, I've noticed this whenever we have our conversations, if we're out on the coast or we're talking on the phone. It's a great sense of awareness that you have, a sense of your own understanding of your presence within ecosystems and the potential effect that you can have or can avoid having as well by the choices that you make. So that,
Thank you.
absolutely, man. That's also, that was a whirlwind quick tour of of Larry in terms of a lot of different things. But there's also, I mean, that's the thing I really noticed about you as soon as we were out in nature, was that you are a nature lover through and through. And I think it was the fact that we were going to go picking mussels, like I said, on the coast, and it probably took us almost an hour to get to the coast because there were so many birds.
Oh yeah.
Birds out in the bushes and running around that required investigation and a bit of analysis. So that was a moment that pricked my ears and with, this guy this guy's into everything that's going on around him, and that's fantastic. I guess what I'd love to do is, if we could, I mean, we already talked a little about Barstow and your experiences in the desert, but if we can go all the way back there, I'd love if you can just talk about some memories. You talked about the spending time at the river where the rivers joined where you were. Is that right?
Where I grew up.
Where you grew up. Like,
Yeah.
so was that where you spent a lot of time? If you can tell me like memories of what kind of animals you saw there.
Oh, okay. Well, interestingly, so one of the things that I would see is that the river ran pretty much year round when I was very young. And then it started to run more intermittently as the water project went in. But because we were in this transitional, or what's the word, where kind of where two ecosystems meet, which is very similar to what happens with rising tide. I mean, it's an aquatic ecosystem, it's the ocean ecosystem, and it's a terrestrial ecosystem with harvesting seaweed or fish. But there in Barstow, I would have access to kind of more riparian, but also the desert. So like one of the things that I saw a lot of were tortoises, for instance. And we, they were just around. And like one year, a desert tortoise just kind of wound up in our yard because we watered grass.
Yeah.
And this tortoise just every morning throughout this summer was just eating our lawn. And it would go out, it would eat for a certain number of hours in the morning, and then it would just disappear. And that would happen every morning. And finally, I realized where it had made a burrow in back of these trees where I couldn't quite see things. And it really gave me the sense that this person has a life. Like, this person is really doing this thing. And there were a couple little nail polish marks on this tortoise, like it had been somebody's. It had become accustomed to people, so it was kind of okay. Yeah. But then I remember in the fall, I think it was just as school was starting. I remember one day in the late morning, this tortoise was just walking off. We never saw it again. And I thought, wow, that is so amazing. I mean, I was maybe in 4th grade or something.
Yeah.
And I thought, this, like, who knows why this person went off to do whatever, and I have no idea. So
yeah,
if that makes,
just create an awareness of nature and
yeah,
how it's interconnected.
Yeah, I also actually really credit my parents for making it a point of saying, like, we are not going to, like, put this tortoise in a pen or try to, have it be our tortoise. It's just going to be here. And it just, so that was a very cool thing that they hadn't, I don't remember them specifically talking about it, but it's interesting to me that they never wanted to have that become a domesticated tortoise. They just, that's like, and maybe they did tell me about that, and I just don't remember. But yeah.
I mean, it's kind of counter to a lot of conventional thinking, right? Where it's oriented, I should say, in this country around how people think about possessions, right? It's about these things are mine. don't want other people to have those things. So
Yeah.
it sounds quite a formative moment to not try and control things or frame it in an idea of like what's yours and what's other people's and all
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
that's cool.
Right. And then, then kind of like in the kind of the less environmentally aware side of that whole thing, the other thing that people were really into in Barstow were dirt bikes and dune buggies. And like I came to understand as I was a teenager that this is not a thing that's really helping these ecosystems, and there are things that happen with those that are really really destructive. They disturb cryptobiotic soils that are these soil layers in the desert that develop over centuries. They're mycorrhizal, they're lichen, they're all these things. And so when you run a vehicle like a dirt bike or a dune buggy over that, it could take hundreds of years for that to heal. And so I became aware of that too. And I thought, oh, that's really fun, because I had a dirt bike when I was younger.
I was going to say, did you dabble?
And it was totally fun. I mean, totally fun. I mean, I was one of those kids who was super coordinated, and I would have become like a motocross whatever because of what I could do, But it was just like, no, I'm not. It's not going to happen. And interestingly, that whole balance thing with dirt biking and kind of bicycling, because I spent my whole childhood on a bicycle, just loved the physicality. I mean, bicycles are much more my thing than motorcycles. I mean, just bicycles, just the whole thing. So one of the things that has made seaweed harvesting possible is my low center of gravity and my balance that I developed as a kid.
Yeah.
I mean, I was the kid on a bicycle who could like start out in a wheelie,
do the tricks,
and like go for literally like do a wheelie for 2 miles, and like then like slow down and stop in a wheelie, and then like I mean, it was like a whole thing. And I was really into jumping, and people would come to watch me jump, and kind of the whole thing. But all those skills I realize are things that I took into seaweed harvesting, and really like we're like walking on ice, and we're getting tangled in these organisms that are 20 feet long, and they're moving in the swell. And I realized that that's something like my wife Erica, who is this long, elegant person who's, I'm 5'9" and she's 5'11", and her waist is 3 inches higher than mine because her legs are so long. Her geometry is such that she literally doesn't have the same kind of balance, so she can't harvest seaweed because her center of gravity is too high. Her geometry is different. And that I find really interesting. Like it's this little adaptation. It's this like physical adaptation that also has made it possible for me to super enjoy this kind of goofy,
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's funny. You did make me think of, it's so true, the kind of desert lifestyle. I would definitely, let's go deep into harvesting seaweed and sea vegetables and all that stuff. We will go there shortly. But I'm still enjoying Barstow life.
Oh, yeah.
For a second. So for me personally, I actually, my wife and I were lucky enough to spend about, 8 months maybe in Joshua Tree, which is not far from Barstow. Right. And a lot of that time we were living in a travel trailer, and it was only like a 14-foot thing, very small. But we were on a dry lake bed just there. It's actually just on the 62, I think it is. I could be wrong. We spent a lot of time on that dry lake bed. And it's funny you say about the thing that you do there is like dirt biking and ripping around the dunes and all that kind of stuff. But the number of times I would be sat, at a fold out chair and table, enjoying but we were just cooking with a barbecue most of the time there outside in the desert. But the number of people who are just ripping around on this dry lake bed, doing donuts.
Oh, yeah.
You saw it all there. People rarely ever go there to do anything other than have reckless fun, I think.
Yeah.
People, even there would be, I mean, I'm not condoning this kind of behavior, but like drunkenly surfing on the back of pickup trucks. all kinds of things. There may have even been some guns involved. I was not anyone. I was just a spectator from far away with some mild concern and a lot of amusement.
Yeah.
But it seems like an interesting place. And the other thing that was really interesting to me was the fact that when you spend some time there in a place that seems so barren, if you actually pause, and it's almost like the environment dictates that you slow down.
Mm-hmm.
And you see so much life, even though it's such a hot, arid place.
Mm-hmm.
There is life everywhere, and it's only once you really spend a bit of time and you look around, you see, coyotes running through, and you see, even sheep, like bighorn sheep. Well, I'm not sure what kind of mountain sheep they were, but like in the mountains just nearby,
Mm-hmm.
and lizards and ants making their merry way across everywhere, and it's a pretty rich place. You just got to look a bit harder, right?
And it has and every one of those critters has their own cycle because they're adapting to that desert ecosystem, and they're so like a lot of what happens in the desert happens at night.
Yes,
in the summertime.
It's so true.
Yeah. So, that's one of the things that was a really formative event for me was when I was an adolescent. I went to a motocross event with some friends, and what people would do is they would, there were enduro races that were long distance, whatever, but there are also these little motocross things that would happen. And right outside of Barstow, somebody basically just kind of roped off this track, and they made a little one-day motocross track.
Okay.
And so they just, set up a little trail, and they kind of, put little barriers, and this is the track, and everybody's got to do laps around this thing. And so I was just there with friends watching this thing, and the thing that I noticed is that as all the bikes started going in this place that hadn't had any activity, any dirt bike activity, and it was happening for hours, all of a sudden there were just all these kangaroo rats and all these rodents were out, and there were lizards out, and they were totally flipped out.
Yeah.
And because the ground is shaking and there's all this stuff happening, and they were just completely, and it had never hit me before, this event, that there are these little tiny critters who are just doing their thing, and like, what the heck's going on when there are these things rumbling around and around and around? And I thought, wow, okay, so that kind of ended my dirt bike career.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never really. It's obvious, I guess, that it's going to have a huge effect, but it's just like the biggest thunderstorm ever known to man.
Oh yeah, and
animal.
these are critters that I had studied, because we actually had this really cool place called the Desert Research Station. It was, I think, I can't remember if it was UCLA, but they had this Desert Research Station that also had an educational component. So school groups would come, and we would do transects, and we would trap mice at night, trap, say, kangaroo rats, whoever came into the trap, and we'd do studies on them. And so I'd already known from when I was in grade school going to this Desert Research Station that these guys shouldn't be out right now. Like, it's daytime, and they don't come out in the daytime, and something's really wrong for them.
Yeah.
So, that's part of it. And that's an interesting thing too, because, the framework part of the framework that I got for realizing how wrong it was the fact that that group had set up this place where kids could come and learn what the critters were doing. And so that is kind of how
So it had an effect.
It really had an effect. Like,
And
whoever my teacher was back there, you had an effect. Like at the Desert Research Station outside of wherever it was, Hinckley, California.
Well, that's a touching testimony if ever I heard one.
Yeah.
So the transition from Barstow to Fort Bragg, was that where you went first?
No, actually, interestingly, from Barstow, I went to Ojai, California, which is down by Santa Barbara. And that was a whole very cool phase of my life that lasted for about 15 years and went there. My parents split up. I was the youngest of 5 boys, actually. And one of my brothers came and was kind of back and forth from Barstow. My mom moved to Ojai. She was actually a spiritual seeker, and she actually had gotten into yoga when we were younger, and then she was interested in some of the spiritual movements that were going on in Ojai, California.
Yes.
And also, Ojai was an amazingly beautiful place. And so for me, growing up in the desert for the first 15 years of my life, and really the only kind of occasional thing that would happen fairly regularly was visiting my brother who lives down in Del Mar, California. So he lives right by the beach in Del Mar, and he's lived there for 50 years. And so I'd come there as a kid and, play in the ocean, and that was all very cool too. But really, it was that introduction to the oak woodlands and to the mountains around, and then kind of eventually mountain biking in that whole area that really expanded my interest in the outdoors. And it also expanded my interest in spirituality and community. And when I was for about 3 years, when I was 18 to 21 or so, I was involved with like the classic hippie community, a commune called the Students of Life, which was centered around Crotona Institute of Theosophies. It was kind of this hodgepodge of young people who'd come together and had started this commune on at a resort outside of Ojai, actually. So there was a group of cabins and trailers, and there was a nonprofit structure that was set up, and we had businesses in town. And so I was a member of that group living on this property. And we had a natural food store, we had an occult bookstore, we had a taxi service, we had a hauling business, and so we were involved with the community. So so I ended up actually going from Ojai with my family to live in Nevada County for about another 13, 14 years. And then split up with now my ex-wife, and moved to the Mendocino Coast in 1992 with my partner at the time. And so that's how I wound up here. Then in 1995, that's when I got involved with Rising Tide, but remember, my ex-partner, Kate Marienchild, started Rising Tide in 1981.
Yes.
So kind of just...
So is that what...
That's a long tangent, so I don't know if that makes sense.
No, tangents are good. We love a rabbit hole here, so...
Okay.
I guess... you clearly have such a strong relationship with the ocean now, and have done for a long time. The move to Fort Bragg, was that motivated by wanting to be close to the ocean, or was it your time spent in Ojai? Because I know that's pretty close to the water.
Yeah.
So what I'm kind of figuring out is, it was like, did you move to the coast because you were like drawn to the coast, or did you then connect with the coast a lot more because you happened to live there?
More that I happen to live there. I mean, in my life, that saying for especially a cis male is kind of like, it all started with a woman, and that's really true for me moving to the coast, and that's really true for me getting involved with Rising Tide, because my relationship with Kate started that relationship, and my interest in the ocean itself. I wasn't free diving at that point. I wasn't doing much in the ocean at that point. But it's more like wanting to do this cool business with Kate that really got me into more local ocean-based wild foods, and then Rising Tide, and developing all the systems and developing the markets and kind of all the things that we developed together.
Yes.
Including the physical infrastructure, because the thing that I left out is I'm also a builder.
Okay.
And was for 30 years was 25 at least. 25 was a really active builder, and a skilled builder too. So like this building we're sitting in right now with the Rising Tide office, the Rising Tide drying room with my shop, is something that I designed and built.
Oh, wow.
It's the same. Yeah.
Okay.
So really, it was kind of all of those things together that kind of, and that's actually why I was up in Nevada County was I was involved with the spiritual community that my brother was in, although I wasn't into that community so much. But I was a member of a builders guild. It was
Okay.
a group of a kind of a collective of builders. So I was one of the people who was doing stuff with that.
Okay.
So now kind of circling. So what was the question again?
I think the question was, what came first, the coast or the love of finding nutritious resources from the
Yeah,
coast?
I would say the coast. And actually, when I moved to the coast in 1992, one of the things that happened was I got involved with the Coast Men's Circle, which is a group of men who are doing men's work on the coast. And that actually happened to start in January of 1992, the first meeting of this group of about 30 to my core group of maybe 20 people started. And the first meeting that I went to was probably the second meeting of this group. And I showed up, so there are all these guys, and there is this amazing spread of food, like stuff that people had grown and they'd cooked, and like there was nothing like from the Safeway deli, right?
Yeah.
And I thought, oh yeah, I like this place. This is cool. Like, like people put serious thought into food. And so that's one of the things I love about the Mendocino Coast and Mendocino County. I mean, Mendocino County is an amazing place for food culture and wine culture and kind of all of that stuff, and for innovative growing of food, and of course innovative pot growing too.
Yes, of course.
And that's kind of all tied into the back to the land thing that happened here.
I guess the thing I'm curious about is that you gained an awareness of like coastal foraging and spearfishing. Can you remember a story or a moment when you first felt compelled to go chasing after fish with a spear gun?
Oh, a moment.
Or is it like an area of
time?
Well,
it's more like what came first for me was loving snorkeling around here. Like there are very few people who just snorkel around here because it's a serious project to snorkel around here. I mean, just getting in the water here is a serious project.
Yeah, for sure.
And if you don't have, because the water is anywhere from 50, on average 50 degrees, but like for instance, I had a thermometer with me when we were harvesting seaweed one day, and the water was 46. And the difference between when the water is at its warmest in the fall, where it could be 55, and say 46 is huge. I mean, it's even with a wetsuit hood, if the water is 46, even with my good hood, I actually have to get in the water and put my hand on my forehead like this for about maybe 3 minutes to prevent myself from getting a headache.
Wow.
Because I have to wait for the blood flow to kind of like slowly acclimate to this, and I actually have a double hood, and that's not as much of an issue, but people don't just snorkel around here because it's, like back in that time, it was when abalone was a big thing, and people would get in the water to snorkel essentially and free dive to get abalone, and abalone dive, the recreational abalone divers. But the ecosystem around here is really beautiful. I mean, there are pink coralline algae, there are giant green sea anemones, there are all kinds of orange and pink and purple sponges, all these amazing little invertebrates around. And I have this distinct memory once I was harvesting seaweed, where I went to Belize, and I had never been in tropical water before, and went to some really beautiful reefs. So I actually stayed offshore on a key for about a week. It was one of the things, and I just snorkeled.
Quick question: where is Belize?
It's by Honduras. It's in Central America. It's kind of sandwiched by. It's like Guatemala is here, Honduras is here, and Belize is coastal here. So Honduras and Belize have coast.
So I'm guessing it's far more tropical kind of.
It's tropical, yeah.
Okay.
So I was in tropical coral, and it was amazingly beautiful. I'd already been harvesting seaweed for a number of years. I went down there, and I just was on this little 10-acre island, and there was coral right off the island, and amazing fish, brilliant fish, amazing corals. Turtles would come up and eat the grass, the seagrass, and the water, of course, was like amazing, like 70, like 78 degrees, and like, oh my God, because harvesting seaweed in 50-degree water is a whole different thing.
Yeah.
But I came back like 3 days after I got back. We were harvesting seaweed, and when we harvest seaweed, we're doing it at a minus tide. So if you think of like this is high tide line, and then say 8 feet lower is a minus tide.
Okay.
And so there are all these amazing critters who are adapted to living a little bit out of the water, but mostly in the water, and they can live kind of in both. And then there are some critters who just like in the really minus tides way down here, where you're just seeing them in that little window of say 3 hours,
yes,
very occasionally during the new moon minus tides and the full moon minus tides. And they're not out of the water very much at all, and so they don't really have to be adapted, but they're amazingly beautiful, and it's all framed in this pink coralline algae with, a bright green sea anemone. So I came back and saw this, and I thought, this is like absolutely as beautiful as Belize. It's just that people don't see it very much because you can't just recreationally like show up on the Mendocino coast and put a mask on and just hop in the water, because all you would feel was that you're friggin' freezing, right? That's the only, like, I do lots of little forays with people to show them, like even local naturalists I've taken out, for instance, who have never been in the water here. But I'll take them out in really specific conditions, when the conditions are perfect, when the visibility is good, and when there isn't a big swell. And they're just blown away by what they're seeing.
Yeah.
And so that's really that initial snorkeling was really kind of that initial love of these ecosystems and the beauty of these ecosystems and the vitality of these ecosystems. Because, in a tropical reef situation, you have these isolated reefs that are tremendously abundant, but then you got sandy habitat that isn't nearly as abundant. And in temperate waters, colder water, there's more life, actually. There's more density of organisms than there is in tropical. Yeah.
How funny.
And it's because the upwelling phenomena in the temperate waters, like for instance, the Galapagos Islands are down in the tropics, but they have cold water because of the geology and because of the ocean currents right there. And so it's really a hot spot of biodiversity and of fecundity because of that cold water that specifically comes up there, and it creates this bloom of life. And so really when I got here and saw that it wasn't just the Mendocino coast is very rocky habitat. So all these organisms can attach basically in what you would say is how would I put this? In business, they say like location is a location. And so what rocky habitat gives organisms is a place to attach in the right location.
Yes.
Whereas when you're in sandy habitat, you're kind of like, you're just at the whim of this moving habitat, and there's no place to attach. And like if, like you're a little invertebrate and like, the local big fish who knows how to kind of burrow in the sand, they just go in there and they grab you and you're done. So there's a limited amount of habitat in soft bottom in what's called soft bottom habitat. But even with the rock, you also need colder water because there's more nutrient density in the colder water. And so that means that you can have more plankton bloom. You have more, especially zooplankton blooms in colder water, and then of course you also get the nutrients for the seaweed, and seaweed does better in colder water. And so you don't get the large structures of seaweed or everything that the seaweed supports. Those are called macro. Seaweed is really macroalgae. There's microalgae / phytoplanktons.
I feel like we're going down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, exactly.
We're going down a big, deep rabbit hole here.
So let's see. So the question is more like, what came first, right?
I mean, the question, all I was wondering is, and we'll definitely go into more detail. I want to know all about rising tide.
I know.
But it's just like your experience. If you can even think of, like, I want to hear a story about when you started spearfishing.
Yes.
You got back out. You were snorkeling.
So
when did you decide
right.
I'm going to chase something with a spear gun or a sling or some kind?
Yeah. So kind of quickly circling back to the Belize, coming back to the coast, like I realized this place is amazing with all the hard bottom, with this these beautiful organisms taking advantage of this. The cold water is amazing. And then I realized, oh yeah, like I could be getting more fish. Okay, so now should we do like take 2 on this next stuff?
Right. So the thing that we were talking about, you were going around snorkeling, and that was quite a commitment in itself because it's not the easiest place to be out in the ocean. I mean, I'll note as well that it can be pretty rough a lot of the time out in the Pacific, apart from a few nice months in the summer, I guess. Mm-hmm. But also, it is really cold. It's not that many people get out there. So you were committed enough to get out there just for the fun of snorkeling.
Yeah, and so interestingly, my son, who is a really physical guy, really adept at all kinds of sports, was getting into diving. And because he was, not living on the coast, but coming to visit, and he was actually harvesting seaweed with us. And so he said, hey, let's start, you want to start spearfishing. And I said, yeah, sure, I'd like to try. And he had a spear gun, and I bought a pole spear, and we went out, and I thought, wow, this is really cool. And he and I did it a couple of times. But then he got busy with other stuff, and I just started getting into spearfishing. And so I got into spearfishing and really starting in a very simple way where I had a pole spear. Wasn't even using a weight belt yet.
Oh, wow.
And I was fishing specifically for perch, which are fish that live in shallow water and basically close to the surface, and I would be in specific species ecosystems where I knew where they were, and I was really successful even before I started using a weight belt and all of that, just with a pole spear. And then I got more and more serious about it and thought, okay, now I need to like start using a weight belt and like learning how to hold my breath longer. And so I never got really good at it, but it got me into the first thing that it got me into is like, okay, this is great. I'm getting some protein out of the ocean now, and that's really good, and I really appreciate doing that. And it also really put me in touch with fish as these people who have this life, who are doing this thing, and I can see that these species like to live here, and they do this and they eat that, and then this other species, like a cabezon is a amazing stealth predator, and I can be cruising along and I don't even see them. And like one instance, for instance, I'm like cruising along. When I became more adept at spearfishing, I was going down deeper, and I'm looking for cabezon because they're a really tasty fish, and I couldn't see anywhere. And I put my hand out and I touched one, and he swam off. It's like, and it was like and I thought, this is so cool that these guys are so well adapted. And so it's really kind of a fascinating thing. I know you and I have in other discussions had this conversation about how we ethically, kind of spiritually, ethically uh, reconcile taking life to eat. And in fact, one of the ways I reconcile taking animal life is the fact that I think that we are very we have this way of empathizing with organisms who are look a lot like us and
That's
who
true.
have characteristics a lot like us, and so it's really taking fish and understanding how they live really puts me in that place that I mentioned before where I cannot deny that this is this person doing this thing, and that, like that species, let's say I'm taking a cabezon, they have been evolving for millions and millions of years longer than we have.
Mm.
And I'm not convinced that we are the apex of evolution.
Okay.
So, like
yeah, just look
we
at
may have a
mushrooms.
cerebral cortex that works and does all these kind of cool things that is so amazing that it may be responsible for the demise of our species, but it might not be the ultimate survival mechanism. It might not even be the ultimate mechanism that makes you happy.
Mm.
I mean, like, so that's a big question. I mean, like, these fish who I see seem to be like really motivated to do what they're doing. Like, I don't doesn't like I don't really see them like being depressed a lot. Like they're just cruising around. I mean, I don't know how, but my point is really that the whole cycle of life is that everything consumes and contributes as part of the nutrient cycle and part of the life and part of the cycle in any given ecosystem. And how can I be part of that nutrient cycle? And there are a lot of questions that I have. So as far as how I got into spearfishing, it was really thinking about a lot of those issues and really liking the fact that I know that fish had a great life.
Yeah.
Until I speared it. And once I spear it, I actually slice the isthmus, which basically bleeds it out.
In the gills.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what I do when I pull fish too. I just immediately kill it to have it go unconscious, or I'll puncture its heart with a knife.
Mm.
And to me, that's all part of the whole cycle of taking food, and it should be part of our industrial food system too, but it's not. And so that's why, for instance, I'm really reluctant to eat meat at a restaurant, eat any animal food at a restaurant unless I know that it's specifically, and I fudge on that for sure.
Yeah.
Back to so it was really my son who said, "Hey, let's do this thing."
Yeah.
And then I got more and more and more and more into it. And then he was just kind of off for a few years, and then he's kind of come back, and we've had opportunities to do it when I've gotten actually better gear, and so he's been able to do that.
So he comes back, and suddenly you're much better than you were.
Yeah, for sure.
And so was there a moment where he's like, "Whoa, hang on, who's better at spearfishing now?"
I don't know. I don't know about
So
that.
that's not the dynamic between you.
Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, but but my son Caleb definitely got me into it, and actually, his kids were very small at the time, and we were into taking them snorkeling too.
Yes.
So that was kind of part of we were spearfishing and freediving at the same time that my grandkids, Skylar and Jasmine, were snorkeling around, and like 5 and 8 kind of thing, So that all of that kind of cemented it, and then interestingly, the thing that was kind of made it easier for me to get into spearfishing was that about couple of years after I got into spearfishing, we had a warm water event.
What does that mean?
And it means that there's something that happened here called, it was called the blob. And so
Catchy.
the blob was something that was identified as this warm water event where the water in this is actually the west coast of North America, but is Eastern Pacific Ocean,
Okay.
because
Yes,
Western
the
Pacific
east
is
side.
Asia,
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
Eastern Pacific is North America or
Mm-hmm.
South America. And so something happened with the currents and with the water temperature, and water temperatures became elevated. And the ecosystems were still doing really well, but it was a great time to learn to free dive and to get more and more into free diving because the water was about 4 to 5 degrees warmer consistently.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it was like, oh yeah, and so this is nice, and of course the other side was I knew the implications of warmer water. They're not good.
Yes.
The ecosystem really needs cold water.
Yes,
So,
as you kind of were talking about earlier on, it's
Right.
part of what makes it
so
so
you know,
rich.
I don't want to go off on a tangent on that because I could. I mean, I really could.
I mean, no doubt. No
Yeah.
doubt. Okay, well, I've got a question though. I'm curious about. I'd love to pick your brains about it. I think you're the first person I can think of that I remember that has referred to definitely fish in this conversation, but also animals as people. What's your thought process or your intention behind that?
It's really that I truly feel that. I mean, in a very visceral sense. I really feel that. I mean, like, you know, I mean, people who have pets know that. I mean, like any 3-year-old knows that. You know, it's like, I love my dog. My dog loves me. It's like, you know, I'm going to give my dog a hug because my dog loves me. And it's not all just 3-year-old fantasy.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, obviously there's a lot there that inexperience and kind of naivety and, you know, whatever. But you know, when I'm, for instance, free diving and I'm like 4 feet from a fish and it's looking at me and it's like looking at me and wondering what I'm up to, and I'm about to spear it,
Yeah.
it's like I'm really ending this person's life. So yeah. And I'll pull the trigger and I'll spear this fish, and that's the end of that fish's life.
Existence.
And like it's something that on some level it's irreconcilable for me. You know, it's kind of like, oh yeah, like I'm really doing this, like, and we really do this, like this is, I'm so it gives me pause. Like I've got to say, I could never be, I'm going to offend people, I'm sure, but I could never be a catch and release fisherman.
No, me neither.
Because basically the way I feel about catch and release is you're just fucking with people.
It's true.
And I cannot get behind it at all. I mean, like, I'm ending this person's life, but I'm going to do it as fast as possible, and I'm going to do it to eat. But, like, it's a real disrespect to think of using another being as sport. It's kind of like bullfighting. Like, to me, catch and release fishing is kind of like bullfighting. You're just going to kind of fuck with somebody's life for a while.
For your own entertainment.
And you've noticed that I haven't done any expletives up to this point, because I feel that strongly about it. And,
Yeah.
you know, that I really feel strongly about other species as having really important experiences for them. And that whenever we're taking food, and from an animal or even from a plant. I mean, we have no idea what goes on in a plant's life, or in this case, with seaweed is algae. When I'm out there harvesting seaweed, and especially a species called sea palm, where it grows really up where almost nothing else can grow. It's out of the water for a lot of hours in any given day. It's being pounded by full force of the open ocean waves. It only grows where it gets hit by the full force of the open ocean waves, as in surf. It's just pounded by surf, and that's where it's developed.
Yeah.
When I'm out there in a sea palm bed, like those guys, those girls, those whatever they are totally into this thing of going through their life cycle. I mean, there's something happening there. There's a vitality there that I feel that could be a hallucination. It could be a sheer hallucination, but my impression is that they're into this thing and they're going to go through this life cycle and they're like committed.
Yeah.
So when I talk about beings, that's the framework that I see. I mean, like my wife and I are really into birding, and right now it's spring on the Mendocino coast, and the birds have come to breed. All the spring birds are coming in. I'm hearing all kinds of people moving in, like the Pacific flycatchers are here, and they're singing, and they're getting ready to breed, and they're having a good time, and they're going through all their dramas. And so that's the context of me seeing animals as beings. you
Yeah.
know.
No, it's a good point, and it's definitely something I can relate to in terms of the first big game animal I took in the US was actually a bear. And so I guess that was probably assisted by the fact that bears are quite human-like in a lot of ways, in the way that they are.
Did you skin it?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a whole,
Right.
especially, I guess, being new to hunting maybe 5 years ago. And so, I always use this expression, but, stripping off the pajamas
Yeah.
and just the sinews of hands and feet and everything is so human.
Yeah.
And I do remember the way that you were saying being 4 foot from a fish and seeing its, I guess, humanity might be the word, but like the personality or the identity.
Yeah,
in
personality.
its
Yeah,
eyes.
personality is a good word.
I definitely saw that with the bear that at first moment was only 6 yards away from me, or maybe, what's that, 30 feet? No, I don't know what my distances are. I'm mixing up my distances now. But there was definitely a moment before I pulled the trigger that it ran a little further, and it was maybe 20, 25 yards away, and it looked over its shoulder at me. But I could see, I'd never forget the look in its eyes. But that's the moment that you make a choice, and I guess it's a choice which the human race has been making for I don't even know how long, because that's not my area of expertise, but we're here because of that choice.
Yep.
So thank you for answering that question. I was just curious. About the backstory as to why you refer to other beings in that way, but it makes complete sense. I understand what you're saying. So I've got another question for you, and it's a bit more specific around spearfishing. And we're going to jump into the rising tide sea vegetable arc of this whole conversation any second now. But this is just a little thing. I like to pick people's big brains about things, and you clearly got a lot of experience spearfishing now. I have no experience spearfishing. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping maybe at some point, you've mentioned it before, I'm going to hold you up to it now.
Yeah.
We can maybe get out there and try and chase some fish. What would be, if you were talking to someone who's a relative noob, what are good, if it's mental thought processes or good tips for how to approach spearfishing? What's the most important things to know before you get in the water? I guess specifically here in Mendocino.
Well, if we're looking at Mendocino, is start slow and start with getting gear right that keeps you warm and comfortable and works.
Okay.
That's the very first thing. And the second thing is maybe the first thing. These are tied for first place.
Okay.
Is come to understand, start monitoring the weather conditions and weather patterns, and especially the swell height and where it tends to be calmer and where it tends to be rougher, and really just get to understand what it takes to get comfortable here. And one of the real disadvantages of what we have going now is that there used to be a dive shop here and they had all the right gear and they knew how to fit it, and there isn't that anymore. So as much as possible, if you're a newbie, find somebody who knows how to do it, or find a good dive shop who knows about the conditions where you live and who can give you specific gear for that specific place and who can give you specific tips about that place.
It sounds like good advice. The reason why I'm laughing is not because of what you said. I realized that was probably the wrong moment to be laughing.
No, it's totally
There's
good.
101 conversational error there.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of a memory. All the things that you said to approach how to approach spearfishing the first time. I mean, this is not a criticism. I had a great time, but the first time I think I got in the ocean was in South Africa with my friend Caden, who's been on the show a couple of times, and he had a bunch of gear, which is like leftover stuff for spearfishing, wetsuit, and everything. So first of all, thank you, Caden. That was a great opportunity to get out in the ocean, but it was pretty rough. Like, it was really rough.
It was like, and it was really not
Poor
fun. Right?
visibility.
Yeah.
I got really seasick. I didn't know you could get seasick in the water.
Yeah.
So it didn't deter me. We got out there again, and I had a much more positive experience. It wasn't terrible, but it was like, wow, this is quite hard and unpleasant at times. So it's funny, the things that you're saying just reminded me of that.
Yeah.
But it's not always perfect, you can't always have perfect ocean. If you're waiting for that
Yeah.
moment here,
Well,
then that's going to take
And so,
you're gonna be waiting a long time.
yeah, I mean, what's interesting to me is that, like in the tropics, the conditions are good a lot of the time, and the water's warm, and yeah, it might be a little blown out, but here on the outer coast with a continental shelf that drops straight off. So what that means is, you've got the continental shelf that drops straight off, as opposed to, say, lots and lots of shallow water. And so all the energy of the open ocean swell comes and hits here full force.
Yes.
And so you really have to monitor the swell conditions, or else it's going to at least be like no fun at all, because there'll be no visibility if the swell is too big, and you'll be pushed around. And like a friend of mine who hadn't been freediving, who grew up freediving, he said, I decided to go out with a friend, and we thought we'd go out to a comfortable place that was really protected. And we knew that there was a big swell. We knew the visibility wouldn't be good. And we went out, and I was seasick in 30 seconds. Because there was no visibility, there's motion right in front of your eyes. So you just have to really watch. So what I do is, when I'm freediving, I actually will just monitor the weather. I mean, like this, I'm this total like weather geek. I'm monitoring the swell. I'm monitoring the sun. Sun gives you better visibility because there's more light penetration. And I'm, okay, 5 days out. Okay. And I'm like clearing my calendar it's like a surfer, right? Except for me, it's not surfs up, it's surfs down. So really. And so like, I have friends who are my age. I'm 66. Who are like, okay, I'm going out with you, but remember, I only go out in a 3 foot or less ocean, which is basically perfect conditions.
Yes.
And it has to be that way for a couple of days for the visibility, for the ocean to settle out.
For everything to calm down.
Yeah, or for the visibility to get better. And so for a beginner, you really have to get all those things, gear, the conditions, all of that together to really make it work. Otherwise, it's totally not fun. I mean, it's like really not fun. Or you could die.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? People do.
Yeah.
I mean, if that was anything that I've been taught by my parents are sailors, and they've sailed around the world in their sailboat. And they taught me from a very young age that you
Oh.
don't mess with the ocean. Or like, it's
Yeah.
not don't mess with it because they mess with it a great deal, but it's just give it the absolute respect that it deserves.
Yeah, and they probably told the stories like, yeah, we tried this thing one time, right? And we're still alive, but, we tried this thing and we're lucky to still be alive. I mean, like almost everybody who deals with these places where they're wonderful, and if you don't know what the conditions are that put it over the edge from safe to not safe, you cannot survive. I mean, you can at least have a really bad time and you may not survive. And like I've had experiences where I might not have survived that if certain things hadn't gone a certain way, like doing some really stupid things. I mean, we could go.
Can you tell me? I would love to hear that story.
Oh, okay. This is a great story. This is good. One of my other interests is a kayak surf.
Okay.
And I'm a goofy kayak surfer. I actually surf. It's kind of like a longboard kayaking. Like the super duper, really skilled kayak surfers go out in these super like they're kind of like the short sport boards that people can do all these tricks in. But I go out in kind of like the ultra longboard kayak, right?
Okay.
And so I was out at at a place where the tide has to be just right on the Mendocino Coast, big river. And so the funny thing is that I'm going out in my kayak, and I've got my best, beautiful wooden paddle. I mean, it's this beautiful handmade wooden paddle, right? And I knew the tide was shifting at Big River, and all the water was going to start draining out of the estuary and basically starting to crank through the surf I was going to be surfing and basically creating an undertow.
Yes.
I mean, a current against the direction I'm trying to go. Like the water's going out and I got to surf coming in as the waves come in, right?
Yeah.
So I'm out there surfing and I'm having a good time, but then it's getting kind of harder, but it's kind of subtle. Like I'm not getting as good of waves and they're kind of wanting to flip me. And so I'm thinking, okay, this isn't so fun, but I'm having a good time. And so I get dumped and my paddle just snaps in half. And I couldn't even figure out how it happened. I got hit with so much force because the undertow of the river coming out and the wave coming in must have pushed the kayak all the way down to the bottom and I was holding my paddle and it probably got caught on the bottom and just snapped.
Yeah.
So I had half a paddle and I paddled in like a canoe, right? And got in and okay, this is the moment of truth. I thought, well, I've got a spare paddle. So I want to be out for a while longer. So I'm just going to go get my spare paddle.
Okay.
But like the tide's going out stronger and stronger. The water's getting greater and greater. But I'm not like
this is not registering.
I was experiencing like this brain death at the time, I guess. And so I go get my other paddle and I start surfing again. And the surf was getting a little bit bigger. And I was in a place where the waves were getting big enough to where I realized I couldn't punch through and get out to sea. But the current was getting so strong, I wasn't able to catch waves anymore because I would start to catch them, and the water was pushing in so fast, I just get flipped.
Whoa.
And my brain wasn't working. Like, basically, I needed to move across the beach to get out of this current, just like they say with rips, all that. But I wasn't thinking, like, again, like there's this thing happening. And so I realized I got to just get into the beach. And so I'd catch a wave, paddle as hard as I could, almost to the beach, hop out of the boat, hop into water about this deep.
Like up to your
up
thighs.
To say my thighs. But the current of the ocean, of the river is so strong, I'm just swept back. And I have to get back on my kayak. And so I'm stuck in this cycle. And between these two swells, I can't get in I can't catch a wave to go into the beach, but I also can't get out because I'm hitting these
Yeah.
big swells. They're just
Yeah.
flipping me over. And so this is at the beach in Mendocino. There are all these people. What I didn't know was that my girlfriend was actually had happened to start walking on Big River Beach at the time. She was going to be somewhere else, and she happened to be walking, and she's seeing me out there for like 15 minutes just getting dumped, and I'm like trapped in this thing. And she's like totally freaked out. Then all of a sudden the siren goes off for the rescue on Mendocino, because there's actually a siren. So somebody had alerted them. But before that actually happened, it actually alerted the Coast Guard. It alerted the Mendocino Volunteer Fire Department. But before that happened, so I'm out there, I'm just getting flipped. And remember, all I have to do is keep moving like 20 feet, 20 feet, 20 feet,
To the
20
side.
feet to the point where there's no more current.
Yeah.
And so like in another 200 yards, there wouldn't have been any more current and I would have been fine. But my brain wasn't working. I mean, like, this is like the classic story, right?
Yeah.
So I wasn't quite sure, like, okay, and just a little aside, by the way, if I had not been wearing a life jacket, I would not have survived.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah,
no doubt.
Yeah.
Like, absolutely not.
Mm.
Yeah. So that's one little detail here. Like
Yeah.
for everybody at home, by the way, if I hadn't had a life jacket on, I wouldn't have survived. So in the distance, I see this person paddling out on a longboard, and I'm thinking, oh, this is interesting. So finally, I'm in this situation where I'm getting flipped, and finally, as I'm holding onto my paddle leash snaps, which has been connecting me to my boat the whole time. So that's what's enabled me to be out of the boat,
Yes.
to pull the
Climb
boat
back
back
in.
to me, hop back on the boat, and then try to do it again. But my paddle leash snapped. The boat just went out to sea. So at that point, I just swam through the surf and out into the open ocean. Again, like if I hadn't had a life jacket,
Yes.
I would have not made it. So at that point, I'm seeing this guy who's paddling out, and he's coming closer and closer. And he's this huge guy with like the classic California's tan and this curly blonde hair coming out, with this barrel-chested guy. And he comes up to me, paddles out, and he says, I can see this happening. My name's Doobie. Hop on. So I get on his longboard, and he paddles me back. And then the Mendocino Fire Department came and took their jet ski through the surf, their rescue ski, and grabbed my boat and brought it back. But, like Doobie really got me out of that. and I am so, Doobie, thank you. And that really is his name.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
That's a great story. I love it. Okay. I'm glad I asked now. I'm glad I asked. So let's talk about rising tide sea vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we talked a lot about spearfishing and your experiences with beings in the ocean. But it sounds like from what you're saying, your involvement with the ocean in terms of harvesting seaweed and sea vegetables started before that.
Yeah.
So how did that begin? Were you harvesting sea vegetables before you got into the business? Was that something that you were trying or you were interested in?
I take that back. No, I wasn't specifically harvesting seaweed at that time, or sea vegetables to eat. I mean, I was eating a little bit of seaweed here and there.
Okay.
But it was really, as I said before, it all started with a woman.
Yeah.
And so it was really Kate being into this business and my relationship with her, and really my excitement about being able to do right livelihood. And the business was very small at that point when I got into a relationship with her. I mean, very small, a fraction of the size it is now. And I thought, well, with my skills of managing crews of people and my ability to come up with physical systems to support the movement of to figure out basically how to harvest and dry. And a lot of the project with harvesting is not the harvesting part of it, but the drying part of it.
Okay.
Because like you harvest it one day and you got to get it dry that day or else it's going to rot.
Yes.
You can refrigerate it. Like, these days we have commercial refrigeration. We have a walk-in at our production facility. So if I absolutely have to, we can take it and just put it in the walk-in overnight if we can't dry all of it that day. But it's really all of that got me. It's really my interest in right livelihood, I think, that got me into harvesting seaweed. It wasn't seaweed that drew me to the business. It was more like Kate had started this business.
Yes.
And I thought, oh, this is very cool. We could do something with this. And so, that's why like this room that we're in is here. And I designed and built and all of that to support all of that
It's
physical
interesting.
infrastructure that was needed to grow the business.
So it sounds like this was all part of the back to the land movement as well. That kind of era, that kind of time that it was becoming more popular to be harvesting. But I guess my question is, that wasn't the beginning of harvesting sea vegetables on this coastline, was it? You mentioned before to me when we chatted that it has happened for quite some time.
Well, and that's where I really want to say that we are living on unceded tribal lands, and that this is right here. This is the traditional lands of the Pomo, the Coast Pomo, and I believe it's Yuki. And I can't remember if Kato was all the way down here, but this is their traditional land that was taken over when European settlement came in. And so we definitely harvest these places that they have been harvesting and still harvest, and they'd been harvesting them for millennia, because, some of so I just want to acknowledge that we are here on tribal land, harvesting something that they had been harvesting for millennia. Yeah,
it's a good thing for us to be aware of, for sure. And I mean, I think it's easy for people to forget, given how the world is now. I guess I have a question. Could you give an outline of how the harvesting process works? You talked about it being easy, like harvesting directly, like cutting the sea vegetables from the land, or sea/land, I guess, is one thing, but drying is quite the other, and that's a complex thing.
Well,
but my question is, if you could give an outline of how the structure works, how does the system work from like the very beginning to the finished product that we are surrounded by right now in packets? Like, how does that process work?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we're wild harvesting. So
yes,
the process of wild harvesting does not involve aquaculture. It's really harvesting in these patches where seaweed occurs naturally without being seeded or anything like that. And so a typical day would be, like a day. Do you want a day in the life? Is that kind of how you want it, or what do you want?
Yeah, I guess it's just like, okay, you choose the area where the seaweed is, I'm guessing, like, and then go from there.
Yeah, so first of all, we like, you have to consider the species, and you have to consider that it only grows at a certain time of the year. It's only at its prime for eating at a certain time of the year. And so in this case, here in the temperate waters on the Mendocino coast, the 4 species that we harvest are really at their prime, depending on the species, starting in, say, late April, early April, then into May, August, June, July. Maybe a couple species might still be fairly good in August. But there's this prime time when you have to harvest, and you have to harvest the right spot with enough biomass, depending on what your needs are. It has to have good access. It has to be calm enough to where you can actually get in. The tide has to be low enough. So we're harvesting intertidal seaweeds, which are we're accessing via the minus tides from either the full moon or the new moon. So they're called spring tides, not tied to the time of year, but they're tied to the fact that they're called spring tides because they'll be way high and then they'll be way low. So we're harvesting in the spring, summer when those tides are very low, right around dawn. That happens to be when they're very low, right around dawn, twice a month.
Okay.
And they stay minus for 5 to 6 days.
Okay.
So we'll go out there. We'll have a truck all loaded up with all of our gear, and we'll have the truck loaded. It'll be myself and maybe 3 other people. And if we're doing a land harvest, we'll pull out the 4 wheelbarrows that are in the truck. We'll load inner tubes. We'll all be in wetsuit. We will have shown up in wetsuits. All the gear is packed the night before. We're meeting at, let's say, 5:30 in the morning, dawn, and go out, push a wheelbarrow for maybe half a mile, and find an accessible spot. In the case of, let's say, laminaria or kombu, we would get into the water with an inner tube strapped to us. It's all gear that I've developed over the years.
Okay.
And that's so we would get in there, harvest about 700 to 1,000 pounds, just cutting the seaweed at low tide, putting it into these bags and putting it up on the rocks. Be in the water for maybe 3 hours, just cutting, getting these bags that are about 40 pounds a piece, putting them up on the rocks. If there's surf, we're basically wading, swimming in surf in these rocky habitats. And once the tide starts coming in, it could be 9:30, 10, we start ferrying the seaweed up the cliff. And it could be a very small cliff of maybe, or small from the rock where we pulled it up to the headlands. It could be very small where it's only 15 or 20 feet.
Yeah.
Or it could be much greater than that. It could be 150 feet in the case of some of the other spots. But in this case, we're only doing, say, 20 feet. So we're hand carrying it up to the wheelbarrows, getting at that point kind of out of some of our wetsuit gear, so that we can do more hauling, get each wheelbarrow filled to about 200 pounds, 200 to 230 pounds a piece. I now, at 66 years old, I get the senior discount. My wheelbarrow only weighs about 175 pounds.
Okay.
Still
Still a decent weight, though.
or maybe somewhere around there. So then we push that wheelbarrow about a half a mile, which is typical, quarter to half a mile,
further inland,
to where the truck and our vehicles are waiting.
Okay.
And by about 10 o'clock, all that seaweed is loaded into tubs in the truck. All the wheelbarrows are back on the truck. Everything's ready to come back to the drying facility, which is going to be a few miles away. And there are 2 or 3 seaweed dryers waiting here. The harvesters are then done. And the dry situation is set up with about 2,000 square feet of table outside in the sun.
Oh, wow.
With trays. And the seaweed gets here, and the dryers immediately start working on spreading all that seaweed in the sun so that they'll have it all spread by about 12:30 or so. And then by about 5:30, it's pretty dang dry if it's a good sunny day.
Wow.
And, of course, that's on the Mendocino coast. It's if.
Yeah, but it helps that you're inland just to touch by a mile.
We're about 4 miles inland.
Okay, so that makes a big difference.
Yeah,
You're out of the
huge
fog
difference.
belt.
It makes a huge difference. And so at about 5:30, the person who comes to do the take-in and the gear prep for the next day will come and consolidate all that seaweed and put it into our finishing room, which is a solar-heated finishing room to get the rest of the heat out of it. And it's a room that I designed and built that has a 10 by 12 skylight, and it's got mass in the concrete floor that absorbs the heat from the sun all day. And And then I designed the building so that the attic also, everybody knows attics get hot.
Yes.
So I designed the attic to be a heat storage also, and a source of dry air,
Okay.
so that the seaweed will come in and fans will go on to dry it out, and then we'll pull heat from the attic to help dry the seaweed further, and then shut that system down when the heat's all gone from the attic, and then dehumidifiers will go on,
Yes.
and those will basically take that room. It's already heated from the sun, and it's going to hold the heat because it's got solar mass in the slab, the concrete slab. And so we'll just turn dehumidifiers on all night, and by the next day, the seaweed is completely dehydrated, and it will be bagged. And so that's, let's say if we started with 700 pounds the day before, we wind up with about 100 pounds dry.
Wow.
So we've been, we just, in that wheelbarrow, that 200-pound wheelbarrow, basically with, it's 6 parts water and 1 part seaweed that we're actually pushing in that wheelbarrow.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's a lot of labor for water.
So during seaweed season, the gym membership isn't really something that's needed.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
That's funny. It's
Yeah.
true. I can only imagine, pushing that heavy weight up a slope, because there's not always an easy way to get up onto the headland from
Right.
from the beach as well.
Yeah. So it's a combination of things depending. Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned a word there when you were describing this process, saying that you do all the harvesting directly from natural sources of seaweed. But you were
Right.
mentioning a term, aquaculture.
Right.
Could you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah. So, aquaculture is something that has a lot of different forms, and kind of aquaculture in its worst incarnation, in my opinion, is something like, say, salmon farming,
Okay.
where it's pretty unequivocally like salmon farming is just bad for the fish. It's bad for the environment. They're even going to GMO fish that are starting to. But there are other forms of aquaculture that have less impact. And so, like, for instance, there's polyculture aquaculture, where you might be growing mussels, you might be growing seaweed, you might be combining and in a way where there are no inputs. Because one of the big issues with, say, salmon farming, to kind of have that be like the unsustainable model of aquaculture, is that the amount of calories that has to go into a pound of edible salmon that comes from a salmon farm is just crazy. I mean, like the number of I can't remember if it's some kind of bait fish. I forget but it's like fish meal. The amount of fish meal that has to go into making 1 pound of salmon is basically more calories than the salmon that you're eating. And so that's to me like the worst form of aquaculture. It's kind of like, but there are other forms of aquaculture that are less, like for instance, the Japanese have been aquaculturing seaweed for a long time. And it's zero input. I mean, in the sense that they're creating these artificial structures. In the case of I'm going from salmon to something that's really sustainable as aquaculture. So for instance, the Japanese.
So how does that work?
Interestingly, the Japanese aquaculture of nori, because nori has been a part of their diet as in sushi nori, and just seaweed in general has been part of Asian cultures, especially, and many other cultures, but part of their culture and a part of their dietary culinary traditions. They have been doing aquaculture where they basically, if you could say it, seed the nori spores, the reproductive spores, onto I believe it's, I'm going to stretch myself in my knowledge a little bit. I believe they're relying on either mussels or clams as one of the bases where the nori spores like to settle, and they put ropes out. I forget exactly how it works, but basically they're doing a very light encouragement of this organism to grow in an area where it pretty much wants to grow, except that there's not good rocky habitat in the sunbelt, right?
Yes.
So they create good habitat in the sunbelt by putting ropes out and seeding it into these ropes with the right substrate to help the whole process, because there's this complicated way that seaweeds grow. And interestingly, by the way, the blooming of Japanese aquaculture happened after a crisis where they didn't have enough nori because their population was increasing, and they were doing mostly wild harvesting. And an American phycologist, and I'm unfortunately blanking on her name, but a woman figured out the life cycle of nori and figured out a way that they could actually seed it. And it was this big boon to their culture. And so there's actually a statue in her memory in I'm forgetting the name of the cove. We actually had it in part of our literature a while back, but I'm blanking on but anyway, so she was the person who developed this really pretty, a sustainable form of aquaculture for the Japanese culture in that case. I mean, the only difference would be they're putting a little bit of gear in the water. You got to wonder about how the gear is affecting the ecosystem.
Yes.
Is there gear loss, and it's whatever.
Yeah.
And so there are people now who are doing more work to aquaculture seaweed and doing polyculture, where they're combining polyculture being aquaculture that might have, say, seaweed as one component, and the seaweed is creating habitat for fish, so they can, in theory, get some fish and some protein out of that by essentially creating an artificial reef is kind of what it happens. Or you can do it with shellfish too, and the seaweed at the same time. And so those are all zero input aquaculture. So then really what you have to think about is what kind of effects are we having on the existing habitat?
Yes.
And so, that's kind of a big question, and all the situations are different, and kind of, it would be a kind of in my mind, it would be, for instance, a really hard argument to make that you could put a seaweed aquaculture farm over really productive hard bottom habitat, which itself creates a lot of seaweed in a relatively shallow area. So so it's kind of like the reason it doesn't happen on the aquaculture doesn't happen on the Mendocino coast is that it's so rough, and the habitat's also, so you'd have gear loss because it's just too rough. Whereas relatively new, there's some good aquaculture stuff that's happening in Humboldt Bay, just north of us, but that's in a situation where they're not going to have gear loss.
It's a bit calmer.
They're not going to have conflicts with marine mammals much. So there are all those things that you have to consider.
Yes.
And of course, those are the things to consider when you're looking at what I would consider sustainable aquaculture, that's in contrast to like salmon aquaculture, which I'm just kind of like, I am like not. I mean, like,
yeah, when we've talked about it before.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. So we touched on this a little bit before, so I don't think we necessarily need to go fully back into that, but there was also like a modern history of harvesting seaweed as part of the back to land movement, like we mentioned, in the 70s and the 80s. And you talked about the kind of macrobiotic benefit of the sea vegetables in their if I'm using the right terminology, like there's definitely like the macrobiotic. Wow, I'm swallowing my own words here. So I guess my question is, or could you tell me a little bit more about that movement and why is seaweed and sea vegetables, or why are seaweed and sea vegetables so good for people to eat?
Oh, good. Yeah, that's great. And actually, I realized that I hadn't defined macrobiotics.
Yeah,
so really, the macrobiotic movement came from Japan, that particular school of thought. And it's really in Japan what macrobiotics is eating whole foods that are appropriate for your region and are local. And that's really the traditional origin of macrobiotics in Japan.
Interesting.
And so it came over here, but of course it had to be adjusted, and it kind of adjusted in. And of course, these are people who are coming over, like, Misho Kushi is a traditional Japanese man, and he's coming over with his traditional Japanese foods that he considers healthy foods, and they are. And so what happened when that came over here was people started adapting it and helping him to adapt it to things that were local here in North America, essentially.
Yes.
And so in California, for instance, like, rice is grown in California, and it's a perfect macrobiotic food because it's for a Californian, because it's a local food that's grown right here, like, right in the Central Valley, not too far from us. So really then seaweed, of course, is considered a superfood because it's got about 15 to 20 times the mineral and trace element content that land plants have.
Oh, wow.
And it's also a source of detoxification because of the elements in it, and because it's highly alkalizing, because our bodies create acids in their normal metabolism. Every athlete knows this, that you've got to, make sure that your electrolyte balance is good so that you can. And so really macrobiotics is using seaweed as a very essential part of the diet, because seaweed has so many micronutrients in it and is so alkalizing, as opposed to some of the other essential elements that we need, like protein, which tends to be acid forming. So we need, leafy green vegetables that are highly nutrient dense and that are also alkalizing and balance the body, in addition to fats and protein and all those things that we need to build muscle and,
yes,
are normal. So seaweed is something that is easy to overlook, and just like vegetables are easy to overlook.
Yeah.
Because, like, when you're super hungry, like, lettuce is not going to cut it, but you got to have lettuce to help the whole thing go. You have to help support your body, or greens or seaweed. And so seaweeds have this, also have, they have all the micronutrients and the trace element nutrients, and they also have a very good mix of all the elements because they're growing in the ocean. And so they have access, to nutrients that, especially in depleted soils, plants just don't have access to. So when you have commercial farming that's completely depleted the soils, and there's no mycorrhizal support for the root systems because they're pumping nitrogen into the soil, and they've killed all the mycorrhizal relationships and all those complex nutrient systems, then all of a sudden you have food that's alive, but it's not really full of all the nutrients. So seaweed growing in the ocean is something that hasn't suffered that plight, because you can't just take the minerals out of the ocean, right?
Yes.
So, and also seaweeds, like, for instance, the laminarians, like kombu, for instance, has something in it called polysaccharides. And polysaccharides are something that have been studied, and they have an effect on the metabolism, where they've actually been seen to be weight loss elements, where they help metabolize sugars and starches. And so seaweeds have this, well, what would the word be? Kind of a synergistic effect in the diet,
Yes.
I mean, one of the simple things I use kombu for is, it seems that if I put kombu in soups and whatever, then it seems to lessen my flatulence after I've eaten beans and that sort of thing.
Really interesting.
Yeah, and
I'm gonna have to give that a go.
and I forget that there's a mechanism in it. There's actually a studied mechanism in that, and it's an element in the seaweed, and it makes the beans more digestible.
How interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm not going to be able to say anything beyond that, because I'll make a bigger fool of myself than I already have. But okay, so.
Well, thank you for clearing that up. That was super helpful to kind of get all that context. I guess you've gone into quite a lot of detail, but as much detail as you're comfortable with, in how that whole world works in terms of, yeah, everything that we just talked about. But I guess one aspect that I would love to talk about is the other benefit. The other benefit that comes from these sea vegetables is like flavor, right? There's like big flavors that
right.
come from it
So,
too. So it's, I think a lot of people are afraid of sea vegetables because they don't necessarily understand their purpose or how their use is applicable within food or cooking or anything in that sense. It's a kind of a new area for people. So
Right.
I guess that's a thing that you must have come across over the last however many years that you've been doing this for.
I mean, Seaweed does not sell like Big Macs. And so there's a reason for that, and part of that is simply cultural. A lot of it is cultural. In fact, I would say most of it is cultural. So if you consider, let's say, Japanese cuisine, there's something in Japanese cuisine called dashi kombu. And kombu is seaweed. It's a particular kind of seaweed. And it has an umami that, when combined with dried bonita fish, is this basic stock in Japanese cooking. Like many recipes have this basic combination of what was in an easily preserved seaweed and an easily preserved dried little bonita fish. And so if you're a traditional person, you don't have refrigeration.
Yes.
And you want something yummy. Let's say you've got a vegetable garden, but you need something to kind of spice everything up. You can grate some bonita fish, and you can put some kombu into this stock, and it creates this rich broth, like chicken stock or whatever, however you want to be, or like with a vegetable stock. And so one of the so when you know how to use this flavor, it becomes an essential part of a flavor profile and of the umami of food. But most people don't know how to use it. Like a good example is we donated some sea palm to a local fundraiser, and we went to the fundraiser, and what we got was this huge pile of sea palm. And it was kind of like, and they had like done kind of what I had described to them that I thought they should do. They made it into this cucumber kind of vinaigrette salad with some wonderful tomatoes. But basically it was just this huge pile of seaweed. And I'm kind of like, I'm into seaweed, but like, this is really too much. Like, seaweed is something that is highly concentrated. It has a lot of flavor, and you don't just want to like chew on a pile of seaweed, right? So that was like a classic example of somebody who didn't really know what they were doing, like turning a lot of people off to seaweed because like they gave, and so it's really using it well. And like in Japanese cooking, for instance, there'll be a seaweed salad, but it will be small, and it will be a seaweed that's very tender, and it will be seaweed that'll have good mouth and great flavor. And so all of that has to work, or else people just get turned off. You know? So yeah.
Use the phrase, and I'm sure a lot of people know what this is, but just in case, umami. It's a descriptive word, but how does one describe umami? What is that?
God,
it's one of the flavor profiles, which is more popular now in kind of common linguistic.
Well, I might have to defer to you to this for this one, because I actually don't exactly know what the full implication of the word is. Like,
well, yes. I mean, I don't have a dictionary right here. Well, I guess we could look it up. But I guess what I would say is it's an incredibly deep, savory flavor.
Oh, right.
It's probably how I would describe umami.
That. Yeah.
You've got your other flavor profiles like sweet, sour, salty, those things. But I think umami is definitely a powerful, savory depth.
It's a term that has specific components, and I can't remember what those are.
Yes.
And it has they say tomato adds to the umami for some reason. And like kombu does. I mean, interestingly, like kombu adds to that flavor balance, the umami, in a way that, in my opinion, nori does not.
Mm.
And nori isn't used in stocks as much because nori has that kind of classic seaweed fishy flavor. And a lot of people are turned off to seaweed because they eat sushi nori, and yeah, you get that that fishy nori flavor from the nori sheet, which I like fine in a sushi roll, and I like fine anyway.
Yes.
But it has a fishy flavor, and whereas say kombu doesn't have that, or sipom doesn't have that, or wakame doesn't have that, it has more of a real savory umami that doesn't have that fishy flavor. So, part of it is being exposed to the right things too.
In your opinion, I mean, you've given some examples already, so maybe I don't need to ask that question, actually. I think that's a good point. But I'd say, do any stories spring to mind about when you were first getting into seaweed and sea vegetables that really showed like the power of them, like how it's applicable and how it can really bring a dish to life? Or is there a dish that you tried early on, or is there anything, any moments that you can remember where you were like, wow, this thing is amazing. The umami is strong in this one.
Well, the thing that comes to mind, I don't know how early it is, but my wife Erica and I got a hold of a bunch of salmon heads, which is basic like salmon heads and salmon backs.
Yes.
And we had decided that we were going to make, a lot of stock and freeze it. And so we did an experiment where we did some with like just kind of vegetable broth and salmon heads, and some with lots of vegetables and lots of kombu in it. And the stock that we made with the kombu was just, it had this depth to it, to the flavor that was way beyond what just kind of the stock that was the salmon heads and the vegetables that were, that were simmered for a long time. And, obviously like the bones and all the contents of the salmon, just like the bonita fish, are really essential to that particular broth. But the seaweed really gave it a depth that it just didn't have without it.
Yeah.
As a flavor.
Yeah. It sounds good.
Yeah, it was like, in fact, we got to do this. So I'm not sure there'll be the salmon.
Is the salmon season coming back?
Well, that's a question. on the North Coast here, will we have a recreation?
Yeah,
They just
fingers
announced there will
crossed.
be no commercial salmon season because the numbers, and they're doing pretty extensive work managing that fishery, which is good.
Okay.
I mean, I appreciate what they're doing, and it's a hard policy situation.
It's definitely not going to make you popular, that's for sure.
Yeah. But anyway, so
but before we get into that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I don't want to get into that rabbit hole.
Okay, so I know that you're very conscious of respecting the environment and respecting the resource in terms of sea vegetables and harvesting them. But do you have any like broader tips for people who might be curious about harvesting their own sea vegetables beyond, I mean, obviously I think you probably want to also elaborate about why it's important to be very wise with your selective choices about what you do harvest and how much you harvest. But so I'm doing a strong foreshadow there for you. But yeah, do you have any kind of advice for people who might be curious about getting more natural sea vegetables?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, if someone's interested in like harvesting their own seaweed, obviously you have to go to a place where there is seaweed. So, and in the case of like the Mendocino Coast, which is the place where I can speak with some authority, and I can't speak with any authority in lots of other places. Like one of the very cool things about harvesting seaweed as a just sheer beginner here on the Mendocino Coast is that there is no highly toxic seaweed on the Mendocino Coast. That isn't the case especially in some tropical waters. But here, we're lucky that really the only seaweed that you would encounter that is somewhat toxic here is something called acid kelp or Desmarestia, the Latin name. And it has a high amount of sulfur in it.
Okay.
And sulfur tastes awful.
Yes.
And you have to eat a lot of sulfur for it to be toxic. And it'll basically like give you a stomach ache. Or if you ate enough, if you essentially forced yourself to eat this awful tasting thing, you might get to the point where if you forced yourself to eat enough, you might throw up.
Okay.
Or you might get a really bad stomach ache.
Yes.
But you wouldn't get what happens with mushrooms where like,
Yes.
like all of a sudden your lips are turning blue. Like,
Yeah,
and things are really not good,
Yeah, it could be a major problem before
Yeah.
you even realize it.
Yeah. And so really the great thing about the seaweeds in the whole northeastern Pacific, let's say from at least Point Conception in Southern California, Central California, even down into San Diego, possibly all the way up into Alaska, is there really isn't a highly toxic seaweed that you're going to encounter, like highly toxic.
Okay.
It just this Desmarestia, which is like tastes awful and like you're not going to eat it, So like especially on the Mendocino, what I can say about the Mendocino coast is somebody can try almost anything, and some of them will be either too tough, they won't taste good, they're doing it in the wrong season. The prime season is like April through the end of July, into August. And you can kind of just go and taste anything and try anything. And you can just kind of do it by feel.
Okay.
Again, unlike mushrooms where you could really
Get in trouble.
Yeah. So that's a very cool thing.
Yeah. Okay, that's good.
And then follow the regulations. Like I'm not completely up on all the sport regulations for harvesting seaweed. Like to do it commercially, one needs a commercial kelp harvester's license. And I believe with a California sport fishing license, you can get 10 pounds of seaweed a day.
Oh wow.
Of wet seaweed a day, except for sea palm. Sea palm is off limits for sport harvesting.
So I would say we've covered a lot of these things, but one thing that you did want to talk about was the nuances of vegan food and vegetarian food, of which you produce a great deal.
All right.
But also being aware that every choice that we make has an impact on the well-being and lives of animals. So does that make sense? So in the sense that, but just necessarily, I think you kind of, what you were saying to me is about being a vegan doesn't mean that you're not harming anyone. So, I mean, I wonder what you thought about that, if you wanted to elaborate more on that.
Right. Yeah. Now, this is kind of like, there are so many aspects of this. And so I'm trying to think of what are the main aspects of it without without taking another hour to talk about this, because there's so many different levels of this. And so the first situation that I would say is we all live in a context of the culture as it is, and industrial food systems and most food that produces most of the calories for most people happening in a way that isn't very sustainable. And so my thought about that is that, for instance, one of the big issues with animal products is that because of the kind of industrial food system that we have, animal products are much less sustainable than they would be if we were producing like true local food, small is beautiful, small local farms that only produce what's locally appropriate and only distribute to local people and don't try to ship it worldwide. And so we're creating so the context, like the ideal world to me, is a place where we're coming up with the ideal food system for every region, and every region has their own food system that works the best for them, and they have to pull foods from out of that region as minimally as possible. And so two things happen in that model. One is that with small scale food production, sensitivity to ecosystems and to organisms, whether they're animals or plants, becomes more sensitive, becomes more ethical, becomes more sustainable when you're doing small scale, because people are doing this with an investment in the local community. Whereas when we globalize our food supply, we're trying to get the cheapest food that's produced in the most efficient manner, that has the most nutrients, hopefully, but not always. In our industrial food system, of course, we all know about corn syrup, for instance. It's really not a food. And so when I'm thinking about veganism, one of the things that I think about is coming as an omnivore, and as an omnivore who really, as much as possible, is thinking about the ethics of what I'm consuming. Am I consuming this life, this animal that has lived a good life and was slaughtered in a sustainable way? And that tends to happen in smaller scale operations. And was it grown in a way that's more sustainable, as in when one is doing permaculture and sustainable farming practice and regenerative farming practices, you have to have animal inputs. And even in like soy farming, for instance, has huge nitrogen needs. And even in organic soy, a lot of those nitrogen needs are supplied by animal byproducts from industrial food systems.
Okay.
And so really, really, it's a really complex topic, because there's the ethics that are also tied to scale. So bigger scale usually means poorer animal treatment. And then bigger scale of agriculture, as in plant protein or fats, also means inputs of animal products from the industrial animal production system, or some kind of heavy inputs, because, for instance, soy is a heavy feeder. It depletes soils. So in a small scale farm, you have animals who are supplying the nitrogen and the essential nutrients in that closed system, who are sustainably producing that soy. But then all of a sudden, you also have these animals you have to do something with. So that gets to, to produce the soy, you have these animals. So like, you have these chickens that are helping fertilize the soy. But then all of a sudden you've got 50 roosters. And so like, there are these issues where, okay, so in my mind, a lot of the problem is that I'm convinced that in a truly small, local, sustainable food system, animals become, in most, we're talking about most habitable places that humans inhabit. This is not the Arctic. No, seriously.
Yeah.
It's a completely different thing.
Yeah.
Animal products become an essential part of the cycle, because you don't just like grow animals to to fertilize your soil, only to just like kill the animal and take it to landfill.
Yeah.
So you've got to cycle the actual animal back into the system, and so part of that would be eating the animal, and using that in the system. I mean, and so we're also getting into these bigger topics where, of course, one of the big problems with humans right now is in most industrialized nations, especially the U.S., an essential nutrient that we deny the planet is our own waste, because we're, like we are not on, you're either in a city sewer system or you're required to use a septic system if you're rural. That's what we have. So those nutrients that we've been cycling through our bodies are all of a sudden trapped, and they're not being distributed into the environment.
That's so interesting.
And so, like, for instance, for years, my ex Kate and I would actually, and my current partner Erica and I also would actually compost our own waste products and put them out, because we couldn't kind of legally put them on plants that we were eating. We would put them on fruit trees. We would put it on our ornamentals, but we would cycle that waste. We would compost our own waste, and it would become at least something kind of like a nutrient cycle, but it wasn't really a perfect nutrient cycle.
How does that work? I'm curious. Can you, like, how does one compost one's own waste? You mean you just dig in a hole in the ground, or are you, like, is there a system in place? If you don't mind me asking.
We would go through I mean, a lot of people do it the super simple way. We weren't doing this, but the super simple way, I've done this in the past. You just dig an outhouse, and then eventually the outhouse hole fills up, and you either have a lot of stamina and you dig a 20-foot outhouse hole and you're super, super strong, or you dig a 5-foot outhouse hole and it comes up to a certain point and you just cover it up, and then it decomposes. There are problems with that, in that you're concentrating human waste, and it's in the water table, and so if you have a well, all that stuff.
If everyone was doing that, it might be problematic.
Yeah, exactly. But but there are ways to do it, and there are people who in fact, there is a book I'll plug called the Humanure Handbook.
Okay.
It's a great book.
Okay.
But getting back to small scale agriculture, thinking of us being a part of an ecosystem, we need to be part of that nutrient cycle. So, veganism is something that I think is an important thing to think about, and is an important ethical choice for people. And we all do things we're comfortable with. Like right now, I'm comfortable looking at a fish in the eyes and spearing it. And I'm okay with that, even though I know I'm ending that person's life, but I'm rationalizing it because they've had a good life. I'm going to end their life as fast as possible. I have very little injury rate. I usually have a successful kill. So, we have a friend who's an avid gardener, and they just can't bear killing gophers. And we kill gophers.
Makes for difficult gardening if you're not able
but
to make amends with that.
it's a choice. I mean, we all have to go with our conscience, and I think it's a combination with in the case of veganism, where sometimes it may be the environmental choice, and in the context of an industrial food system, it's better probably, but there are hidden costs because of the animal inputs into a lot of even organic big ag monoculture. So again, my thought is that it really comes to local, and you need to eat in an ideal world, in the perfect world, we would be eating locally. We would be eating in a way that has been proven to work in the local ecosystem and has as little outside inputs as possible. And I think that fossil fuels have given us this way of rationalizing a lot of things in the food system because we can get them.
True.
And they really are not sustainable. And so, that's all mixed in there. That complex, it's a really complex issue.
Yeah. But I think it's a good thing. It's great for you to bring up the complexity of it. And I mean, I'm sure you're just touching the surface, but there's a lot of things I didn't know about there in terms of implications about the choices that people make. Whatever camp they like to put themselves in, whether you're a vegan, whether you're a omnivore, whether you're a carnivore, everything you choose to do is going to have an impact of some kind on the ecosystem and the animals around you. And I think it seems like, from what you're saying, and tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but it seems it's easy to be a little naive about everything that's going on. So thanks for informing me.
You're welcome. Thank you for hearing it.
I think I asked you this already, potentially, but maybe I'll frame it in a slightly different way, which is how can people learn more information about harvesting seaweed and kelp? I mean, you gave some advice about people if they were thinking about getting out there and harvesting, but there are other resources. And I think you actually mentioned that there is a website about ecosystems, bull kelp ecosystems, and also there's a festival coming up, right?
Oh, right. Yeah. In fact, my brain completely lost that in preparation for this interview. Yeah, there's actually
Is it here in Fort Bragg?
It's going to be on the Mendocino coast.
On the Mendocino coast, and I've got here. It's going to be for 5 weeks in the summer.
Right, and
starting in May.
Should we cut this and then I can give all the info, because I have it actually all written out real quick.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's do it.
We'll pause
we'll pause and you can grab.
Okay, I'll go grab.
I know right way. Sounds good.
Holy shit! I forgot about this. My homework. Okay, so we're rolling, right?
We're rolling.
Okay. So a great place to get information to start is go to bullkelp.info.
Okay.
And that's a great website that has just pretty exhaustive information about the whole ecosystem that is reliant on kelp and on seaweed as the base of the as the underpinnings of the ecosystem. And for people who are interested in, for instance, having a seaweed walk and finding out what's edible, or finding out more of the biology of seaweeds, there is going to be the North Coast Kelp Festival happening in just a couple of weeks. I'm going to look at my cheat sheet here. So it's starting on May 18th and going till June 17th, and it's an amazing multi-weekend event. So every weekend from May 18th to June 17th, there'll be a kelp exhibit at the Mendocino Art Center. There'll be ceramics workshops. There'll be cyanotype workshops. I'll be leading a walk one weekend with another couple of people. A woman who's an amazing phycologist, person who studies kelp is Kathy Ann Miller, who's an icon in the whole seaweed algae taxonomy, and she has super interesting stuff about how seaweeds live. And let's see, I'll be leading a walk on the edible seaweeds. There'll be all kinds of things going with the Noyo Science Center, which is a great local organization. There'll be the Pomo dancers will be present at the Mendocino Art Center. I forget which weekend, but that's happening. They'll be talking about seaweed and its traditional uses.
Okay, so a slight correction on the correct address to go if you are looking to go to the specific North Coast Kelp Fest. Then you need to head to northcoastkelpfest.org. All one word, northcoastkelpfest.org.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And I'll put a link in the show notes as well for
Great.
anybody who's interested. They can go there and they can get a quick link through.
Yeah. And
Okay.
really my kudos goes out to Josie Island for really getting this going on the Mendocino coast, and her amazing efforts to pull everybody together and
To make the
kind of
festival
conceive this
happen.
thing. Yeah.
Amazing.
So
Well, you've given a bunch of info about the Bull Kelp Festival. God, I'm swallowing my own words there. But how can people reach you and find Rising Tide Sea Vegetables as a chance to just kind of, if you want to direct anyone anywhere, then
it's
where's the best
Rising
place
Tide,
to go?
Rising Tide. Just Google Rising Tide Sea Vegetables and it will come up. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Simple.
Or Love Seaweed is a good one. That's our other name. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. If anyone listening is interested and wants to check out more and wants to see some of the products available, of which I'm surrounded by boxes, there are many, many different flavors here. You can go there and check it out.
All right. Well, thank you for the interview.
Thank you for opening my eyes to everything that's going on around here.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been fun.
Right. That wraps up another episode. Thank you again to Larry for all his skills and stories and tidbits and advice and for letting me visit him in his home. So that was all fantastic. Thank you for the whole Larry Knowles experience, Larry. And to everyone listening, if you're still here, then thanks. I'm going to chalk that up as a compliment. Again, if you are curious about coastal ecosystems, then there's some great resources that were mentioned by Larry in the podcast, but I've also put them down in the show notes, so just jump there if you don't want to be scrolling through the podcast to search for those good bits, those nubbins. Right, that's all for now. Thanks for listening, and until next time.